Good afternoon. My name is Chris Wiest. I'm an attorney in Northern Kentucky. And among other things, we've been handling COVID related litigation. Before that, I've been doing some vaccine work with, in part, some folks who do this work nationally, the vaccine rights work. And I've been doing that since about, I think, 2019 when we had the chickenpox case in Boone County with the chickenpox vaccine. I'd like to think that we are up to speed on these issues. And before I dig in, I've got a presentation today that we'll sort of use. I also put out a client alert a couple days ago, and the purpose of this presentation mostly is not to talk about whether or not an employer. I mean, we will get into some of these issues. Can an employer require a vaccine? What exemptions are required. We're going to talk about some of that right now. It is our opinion right now that mandates are illegal under the emergency use authorization statutes, coupled with the Kentucky discharge against public policy cause of action that employees have. The problem is that I think is we're looking at like a week or two, maybe 3 weeks until FDA does full approval on the vaccines, particularly, I'm referring today mostly to the vaccines for COVID-19. And once that happens, that discharge against public policy goes away, and we're back to um, what are the fundamental abilities to avoid, an employer requirement like a vaccine. And I am assuming, for purposes of today's discussion, before we get into the presentation, that we are talking about non-governmental employers, which means that if you work for a governmental entity, the constitutional rights will trigger, and there's some additional protections you may have working for a government versus working for a private employer. But for today's purposes, for today's presentation, we're going to look at private employers. I'm going to go through a presentation on this, and um, before we get into it, I just kind of wanted to give a 30,000 foot overview. First of all, um, there is really two main ways to avoid a vaccination requirement. One is religious freedom under Title VII. Second is a medical exemption under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to talk about both of those today, putting in for the exemptions, what those look like, pitfalls to avoid. But I need to tell you that none of this supplants what I would call individual advice for your particular situation. And you're going to want to look at your employer's policies um, to deal with it. One other caveat: some of the protections require certain sized businesses, and so at the federal level, I think it's 15 employers. If you have less than that, you may not even have the right to submit for an exemption. Just be aware of that for your smaller employers. Let's go ahead. I'm going to share this presentation. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, um, if I can. And let's go run the um, slideshow if I can find it. There we go. So we're talking about applying for exemptions today. Number one, do not quit, tender your resignation, or indicate that you will not comply with company policy. Do not make those statements, even if that's what you're thinking. If it comes to it, do not do it, because if you quit or you tender your resignation, you're going to probably lose your rights to unemployment, and you possibly are going to have issues with creating a cause of action under either Title VII for a religious freedom issue, or under the Americans with Disabilities for a medical exemption. And so, we need to be careful that we're not waiving our rights. The other thing is, and this has been advice that I've given clients, we're not here to die on hills. And by that, I mean, some folks went in and they filed a lawsuit down in Houston against the hospital. My understanding is the hospital offered religious and medical exemptions, and they just said that they weren't going to do that. They were just going to sue the hospital instead. Um, Generally speaking, in this area, lawsuits are a final option. It doesn't mean that they're not an option. They are an option. But if we can get people out of these requirements without resorting to a lawsuit, that's the preferred route. I'm willing to make referrals to a doctor willing to write a medical note to obtain a medical exemption if you've already had COVID-19 and you've recovered, which means you've got natural immunity. you have any kind of history of adverse reaction to any vaccine or any ingredient in a vaccine, you have a history of anaphylaxis, or you're pregnant or planning to get pregnant, and frankly, if you have other conditions, medical conditions about why you have vaccine concerns, I'm willing to refer you to the doc. She requires a telemedicine visit, but she is willing to write. And what you're going to find right now is that very few doctors are willing to write, particularly if they are part of a larger hospital system, or they're part of um, large medical practices. They're not willing to write exemptions. I'm willing to make referrals to a doctor that is willing to do that. She does require like a Zoom telemedicine visit. Um, and on the religious exemptions, we need to look at how to claim that as well. I will take questions at the end of this presentation. A couple more rules. The employer can probably place reasonable procedural hurdles on this, such as sworn statements, statements from clergy, or statements from a medical provider. And the key is figuring out what they're requiring and then jumping through the hurdles. And generally speaking, we can comply with documentation requirements, including getting clergy statements, particularly if we know in advance what the employer is requiring. Of course, if it's an unreasonable requirement, we can challenge that. But a lot of this is aimed towards putting you in the best position to avoid the requirements. Let's talk about the religious exemption. Title VII protects you against religious violations in your employment, as long as it doesn't cause an undue burden to the employer. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But the easiest and quickest route to this is probably to cite the fact that the Pfizer and Moderna preformed confirmation testing, in other words, how they developed the vaccine, used fetal cell lines. Both companies used the fetal cell line HEK293 in the confirmation phase to ensure the vaccines work. And they're all descended from tissue taken from a 1973 elective abortion. And so, from a religious standpoint, citing that as a basis not to obtain the vaccine is a fairly straightforward way to trigger, what I would call, a conscious, sincerely held religious belief that would be a basis to avoid the vaccine. They don't actually use them in production, but, and you need to be aware, if you're a Catholic, that the Vatican has put out statements that the harm from the abortions, frankly, are not, because it's remote in time, are not outweighed by the harm from COVID-19. But, this is the basis, I think, to trigger a religious exemption and to articulate what that exemption is. J&J actually uses fetal cell lines in vaccine development, confirmation, and production. So, you're actually dealing with, fetal cells in the production of the vaccine for J&J, which makes it even more sort of objectionable. Obviously, there is some support in the Bible for the protection of the unborn. And, what I'm doing is basically laying out for you a way to articulate a religious exemption that's couched in the fetal cell lines that were used in the vaccine development. If this is, a route that you want to go and you're able to articulate it. We do not waive any rights in filling out any form from an employer. And if there's a waiver, it may be appropriate to strike it out. What do I mean by that? If they say, you submit this, but you're subject to some absurd, requirement, including, being discharged, if there's an outbreak, whatever it is. I mean, we look at it case by case basis. Right now, if an employer has a mask or COVID testing penalty, it's appropriate to evaluate that. And what we're trying to figure out is the employer interested in preventing COVID in the workplace? Or are they interested in simply punishing you for exercising a right? If it's the latter, it's likely a violation of the law. If it's the former, they're probably going to be upheld. And generally speaking, right now, as objectionable as masks are to folks, or COVID testing is, getting jabbed with something, in your body that creates an immune response could be more objectionable. And frankly, we're sort of picking battles back to what hill do we want to die on. If the employer offers, quote, a leave of absence unpaid, or otherwise suggests a penalty for not vaccinating, we need to push back on that and say that that's not appropriate. And if necessary, we're willing to write letters to deal with those issues. But, if it's, you got to wear a mask or you got to be tested every so often for COVID, those are a little bit harder. And frankly, right now we're trying to avoid vaccine requirements versus masking requirements, as objectionable as those are from private employers. Again, the government's a little different. And we could talk about what, the government issues are in a little bit. You probably need to identify reasonable accommodations in your exemption request. It's not generally enough for you to say, hey, I've got a religious or a medical exemption. Generally, we want to make other suggestions. That might be letting you telework if you've been able to do so in the past in particular. If you're naturally immune because you've had the disease and recovered, that should be documented by you because it undermines employer interests in forcing vaccination. You might want to agree to temperature testing in the request or routine hand washing or other ways to accommodate, the spread of this, just to show that you're making an effort to sort of engage, the employer's interest. But that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to submit in an accommodation request, because at the end of the day, they are allowed to burden your religious beliefs and to burden your medical beliefs. If it would otherwise cause an undue burden. And if we document steps we're willing to take to sort of address their interest, it makes it harder for them not to grant the exemption. And so those are the things that we want to go and do in an exemption request. If that fails, of course, there's protests, there's walkouts, there's lawsuits. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not resign, do not quit. Let them fire you. We can fight that later. If you resign and you quit, you're probably waiving your rights and you're going to be out of luck. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to take any questions and answers in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. I'll just kind of take those step by step. Somebody said, I'm a nurse in Kentucky and Illinois. The mandate allows religious and medical exemptions. What if I've never filed an exemption before? We just walked through the kinds of things that you're going to want to put in an exemption request. That is the kind of stuff that, you're going to want to lay out, why it is that you are opposed. And also, again, I recommend offering reasonable accommodations that you're willing to take, for that step. All right. Employers saying they won't accept an exemption letter. They can say that, but you need to go and submit the letter anyways. You need to document it and go through the steps, because if you don't request it, you're not necessarily triggering the requirements of the law. And so you need to put the request in, even if they're quote unquote not accepting it. Military, the military, that's a really tough issue because they're under the UCMJ. My understanding is that they've timed those mandates in a way to be post FDA approval. I'm not sure about that. The military is a really interesting area, and honestly, that's a subject for a different day. I think probably those military members, because of the environment they're in and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I mean, that's a really, really hard case to make. And I don't know if anybody was around for this. There was a lot of anthrax walkouts in the late 90s, early 2000s, anthrax vaccine walkouts where people refused to get the anthrax vaccine, and there was punishment that was involved. Where can we contact you for the medical exemptions? If you want to engage our office to review a medical exemption request, there's two ways that this thing arises. And this is true for the religious exemptions too. Sometimes the employer has a form and we want to look at those forms to make sure there's not a rights waiver. Generally, if it's on their form, you probably need to submit it on their form. If the employer themselves does not have an exemption request, then you'll want to make your own, and it will want to lay out the fact that you're asking for, and these are the buzzwords, reasonable accommodations from their mandatory vaccine policy because of your sincerely held religious beliefs and medical belief and medical conditions if a medical exemption applies. And those are the things that you'll want to deal with. Somebody asked, where are the employer policies? Look at the employer policies. Your employer, I'm sure, has some mandatory vaccine policy. You're entitled to ask them for a copy of it. Yes, this is recorded. As a remote worker, I'm required to test frequently if I use the exemption option. Could this be considered punitive? It depends on if you ever come in the office and how often is frequent. And so those are facts and circumstances. Doctor reference for pregnancy, prior COVID infection. I'm going to put this out on YouTube publicly. I've got some doctors that are willing to write. I don't want the medical board sending them nasty grams. So I hope you'll excuse me for not sharing that in this presentation. You send me an email, I'll make the referral. It will be available. Yeah, presentation will be available to download. What's the likelihood of there being legislation to block the mandates? There is pre-filed legislation, BR 106. I will tell you that that there was proposals against employer mandates last session. They didn't pass it. I don't know. Someone asked about university exemptions for students. Universities being public accommodations are subject to the same requirements of the ADA and Title VII. And so again, I think it's just an issue of, the request needs to be made in writing. If it's a public university in particular, private universities, again, we need to go through the request. As I said, I'm going to put this up. The slide presentation, I will put out the slide presentation on Scribd, and I'll also put a link to the video up on YouTube on my website. If you've got if you need a doctor recommendation, let me know, and just email me. I'll put my email up once more, and we'll kind of go from there. Nursing students required to get the vaccine, they say no exemptions, period. I would say that that may require a letter from a lawyer to the program. Federal employees are going to be subject to the United States Constitution. What other options do you have? The answer is that we may need to look at a lawsuit for federal employees. My understanding is federal employees, there are exemptions that they're offering, including for religion. In the federal context, religion, there's a RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and so that's going to be triggered in the religion context. You're going to want to submit the religious claim if you've got one. All right. Employee of a private business contracted to the state, possible. You want to look at coordination between the state to see if you're looking at state action and thus the constitutional issues. Testing positive for COVID antibodies and natural immunity is a way, I think, to document, that there's no employer interest in requiring it. All right. Policy. Again, you're going to employer policies. You're going to want to look at the actual employer policies. They should have it out. I'm going to put my email up right now while I go through. This, if anybody needs it. There's my email. If you need a doctor referral, I will send you her contact information. You'll need to do a telemedicine consult with her. She may need to look at your prior files. I don't know. Let me see. No, I did not say working for a government agency helps give immunity to mandatory vaccines. Working for a government agency triggers the United States Constitution, which gives rise to additional potential claims beyond the religious and medical exemptions that we're talking about. I cannot respond to whether or not the doctor will write a note for any particular circumstance. You need to go and see what the doctor is willing to do, and I'm not in a position to speak for her. Generally speaking, though, I could tell you she's against the mandates. From a legal standpoint, what would you consider reasonable accommodations? I think an employer that requires a daily temperature test would probably, you're not going to be able to avoid that. You should offer that. You should offer hand washing. You should offer telework if it's available in your work field. Those are the sorts of reasonable accommodations you should offer as part of requesting an exemption. If the Bible verses that I quoted aren't your religion, and you're not Christian or Jewish, which would be covered by those verses, then there's other probable religious sort of texts that you may be able to go to with your own religion. I can't research that for you. I'm more familiar with the Christian and Jewish faith, and so that's where I pulled the particular Bible verses for. I don't know what any particular hospital is going to do in terms of, or any particular employer is going to do where they are with their exemptions. But if they don't have a process in place, you should write HR a letter on your own requesting an exemption, particularly if there's a deadline coming up. Can you hold employers liable if you're injured? The answer to that is possibly under workers' compensation law. We'll need, you may need medical proof to show that it injured you, you didn't have a condition before, you developed it shortly after vaccine, et cetera. There's nothing you can require them to sign for that, but workers' compensation laws may provide that already. It's a little fuzzy. All right. Teachers in public schools, again, these accommodations I think are going to be applicable in both contexts. And, you know, I think, those are the sorts of things, both the religious and the medical exemptions that we need to have people look at. Licensing requirements is a vaccine requirement. That's the kind of government action that we would look to challenge. If you're given a piece of paper that shows you're voluntarily quitting, you should refuse to sign it. Make them fire you and request an exemption. Let me see other questions. Will protesting outside of your healthcare facility place you at risk of termination? Possibly, although, that's concerted labor sort of protests that could trigger certain other rights. I don't know that I would ever recommend that an employer fire somebody for engaging in protest, particularly if it's on a public sidewalk and not on the employer's property. You should not protest on the employer's property. I did record. It will be up on Facebook. I'll post it on my YouTube. Let me see. Schools, I don't expect mandatory vaccine requirements in part because Senate Bill 8, I think, dealt with it, and Kentucky law has RFRA, and I just don't see schools pushing the religious issue. You don't need the doctor's signature for a religious exemption. You do probably for the medical exemption. You should be able to fill out your own religious exemption if you need a religious, folks and to figure it out. All right. As an aside, I mean, a lot of the work I'm doing is with Aaron Seary, who represents the Informed Consent Action Network, which has been pushing back against vaccine mandates for the better part of a decade. Aaron's kind of their go-to attorney, and I've been doing some vaccine rights work with Aaron in some contexts. And frankly, if we do a case here in Kentucky, and I do expect we'll do some test cases, we'll kind of go from there. What if you have agreed to flu shots previously? If you just want to document it, you could say that you recently learned that it came from, it was derived from the Board of Fetal Cells, and that's given rise to your objection. You'll need to deal with that. All right. I think that's, somebody asked about constitutional protections that might be available for federal government employees. We are bringing lawsuits over the next couple weeks in a couple different forums in a couple different contexts. Under including but not limited to the Cruzan case that talks about the right to make informed medical consent procedures under the 14th Amendment. We're bringing some of these constitutional test cases. Honestly, it's kind of a case by case basis, and we're bringing them strategically. I think, let me see, it's 4:23. I'll take a couple more questions. Do employers have right to your medical info under HIPAA? If you want, HIPAA does not protect you from sharing your medical information with your employer, particularly if you're claiming an exemption. Everybody thinks HIPAA is some sort of shield. It is not. I urge people to be a little bit careful. Unions, possibly you should use your union representatives. If not, you should do it directly. I can't write blanket letters. I'm not going to write blanket letters because I think every employer's policy is going to be a little different. And I've sort of outlined what needs to be in the letters. And I think all of those things need to be in the letters, but some employers have forms that need to be filled out. You should do that. And that's the kind of stuff that sort of a case by case basis. All right. I'll just take a couple more. Right now, I am generally not taking cases with mask mandates as penalties because honestly, we're dealing with actual vaccine mandates where they're not even allowing people to get out of it by wearing a mask. And we want to pick the most egregious cases first as test cases. That's what we're planning. I will put out on my website both this presentation as well as this video. I'll put out, not on my website, but on my Facebook for folks to look at. Somebody asked, how's it being mandated when it's under the EUA? The answer is look at the compliance date on most of these mandates. Most of these employers, including the hospitals, are putting this out with a delayed compliance date, usually mid-September. I think most of the hospitals are. That's being done deliberately, and it's being done deliberately because they are anticipating what I am anticipating, which is full FDA approval in the next 3 to 4 weeks. The advice I've given today is federal advice for the most part. And so it's going to be applicable in every state, including Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, et cetera. I'm not licensed in Indiana. I'm not giving advice under Indiana state law. But the federal rights in Title VII for religious freedoms under the Americans with Disabilities Act for the medical freedoms, these are universal federal laws that are applicable all over the country. And that is it on this presentation. There's other questions about other topics that I am not going to raise or not going to address within this presentation because we're recording it. But I think that concludes the presentation. And if it's okay with you all,